This is Dr. Robert C. Newman in his Synoptic Gospels course, lecture number 2 on intertestamental backgrounds.
Good afternoon. We're continuing a 12-part series, course, if you like, on the Synoptic Gospels. In our first sessions, which we might call Unit 1, we looked at the historical Jesus, and basically a tour of very quick sketches, some non-Christian views of Jesus, and then of some claimed historical views of Jesus, which basically fell in the category of theological liberalism of one sort or another. And then at the end, pointed out where that was headed, looked a little bit at the arguments used for such position against the miraculous, and then tried to respond to those. We now move on to a second unit, which is rather different but also relevant to the whole matter of the Synoptic Gospels, and that's looking at the Jewish background of the New Testament. To understand the New Testament, especially the Gospels, it's helpful to know a good deal about the Old Testament, but it's also helpful to know something of what went on during the 4 centuries that separate the end of the Old Testament narrative from the beginning of the New Testament narrative. It is this latter that we wish to look at here, called in Christian circles the Intertestament period, but understandably in Jewish circles not called the Intertestament period. They typically call it the Second Temple period. So we want to think a little bit first about what ancient sources of information we have regarding the Intertestament period. And we have, first of all, some predictive passages in the Old Testament, and I'm going to come back in just a couple minutes and take a look at Daniel's overview of the period, sketched in terms of the image that Daniel sees in Daniel chapter 2, and then the Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the wild beasts in Daniel chapter 7, I believe that is. Besides that, we have some religious writings of the Jews, mostly during the Intertestament period, that we call the Old Testament Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. These have been accepted by some Christian churches as a part of the Bible. Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox Church accept the material we call the Old Testament Apocrypha, and some of the smaller regional churches, Ethiopic Church and such, have accepted some of the other material that we now call the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. So religious writings of the Jews, mostly during the Intertestament period, though we don't believe that they are inspired writings, they do give us some insight into the culture, the religious ideas of some of the sects, and some of the biblical interpretation of the period, and so would be helpful in that direction. Besides that, we have 2 individual writers that we know by name and approximate dates that give us information on this period, and that is Philo of Alexandria, born perhaps around 20 BC and lived past 40 AD, a Jewish person living in the a large Greek city in the northern delta of the Nile called Alexandria. This particular Jew would be what we call a Hellenistic Jew, had adopted a great deal of the Greek culture. He had studied Greek philosophy, and yet he was trying to be faithful to the Bible as well. So he tried to combine the Old Testament with selected ideas from Greek philosophy. We see some partial accommodation to Hellenism there. In his position, he speaks of people who accommodated far more strongly than he did. He had a tendency to allegorize a lot of the laws, but he felt you should obey them, whereas there were other Hellenistic Jews who thought that having allegorized the laws, you did not need to obey them literally. So he would be a moderate Hellenist, if you like. Moving north from him up to the Jerusalem area, we have the individual Josephus, or often known as Flavius Josephus, though that's his Latin name. He was born in 37 AD and lived to sometime after 100 AD. He would have been less Hellenized. He was a Jew involved on both sides of the Jewish War, 66 to 73, the revolt against Rome, which had rather disastrous consequences. Started out on the Jewish side, though he had visited Rome before that time, and perhaps did not feel too optimistic about the chances of the Jews against Rome, but when he, as a general for the defense of Galilee, was surrounded in the city of Jotapata by Roman army, he and some others hid and drew straws for who would kill who. They were going to commit suicide, and somehow Josephus wound up with the best or next to best straw and convinced the one other guy who was still alive at that point that they should give themselves up to the Jews, give themselves up to the Romans. When they did that, Josephus said, "I have a message from God for the Roman general Vespasian." And when Vespasian heard him, Josephus said, "God has told me that you're going to be the emperor of Rome." Well, Vespasian kept Josephus alive to see whether that would turn out to be true or not, and perhaps he was influenced by Josephus' prediction as well, and lo and behold, with some work of his own, he did wind up being the emperor in the course of the next 2 or 3 years. And so Josephus, who had become a slave and being captured and could have been put to death, and probably would have been put to death otherwise, was now made a freedman and released. And in the course of about 10 years after that, he accommodated his patron Vespasian by writing a history of the Jewish War. So writing about 80-something A.D., he wrote the Jewish War. And then about 25 years after that, he wrote a work called Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus' Jewish War starts about the time of Alexander and then comes up to the end of the Jewish War. And the Antiquities goes all the way back to Genesis, kind of retells the Old Testament with some additions here and there, and comes up to the outbreak of the Jewish War. So 2 very important writings, both of which cover the Intertestament period. Besides the predictive passages in the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, Philo, and Josephus, we also have the very famous Dead Sea Scrolls, which is literature written or copied by a sect that had headquarters, at least an important encampment, if you like, of their group at the place we call Qumran, perhaps 20 miles southeast of Jerusalem, something like that. We think it was probably some sort of the Essenes, seem to match in many, many ways. And, of course, a great deal of what we have there are basically copies of Scripture that they had kept, and therefore some of the very earliest copies we have of the different books of the Bible in Hebrew, but also some of their own literature, and also some literature which may or may not have been their own, some of the Old Testament pseudepigrapha, both Enoch and Jubilees, have been found fragmentary there anyway in Hebrew. So their own literature, at least, gives us some information about that particular sect, how they interpreted the Bible, things of that sort. From a later period, starting perhaps 200 A.D. and running on to maybe 600 A.D. or so, we have the rabbinic literature, which is the writing down of what we might think of as the tradition of the rabbis, the tradition of the Pharisees even, the sort of thing that Jesus speaks about, but which was probably totally in oral form at Jesus' own ministry, but came to be written down in the earliest part, the Mishnah, about 200 A.D., and the Talmuds, one about 400 and one about 550. Those are all compilations, if you like, of the oral tradition of the rabbis. And then some biblical translation, paraphrases, commentaries, etc., midrashim. So those give us some important information as well. So those are our basic ancient sources of information on the Intertestament period. We want to turn next to have a quick look at Daniel's overview of the period, because we will use this as sort of part of our way to structure our discussion of the Intertestament period. In Daniel chapter 2, Daniel is given a vision in which he sees a strange statue. It's a statue that in verse 32 is described as having a head of gold, and then its breast and arms, or the upper body, if you like, in verse 32 is described as being made of silver. Its belly and sides, in the same verse, described as being of bronze. Its legs of iron, verse 33. And then its feet, part iron, part clay, verse 33. And then the action that we see in this, after a description of this image, we have one brief action that a stone cut without hands falls down and smashes the image, and then grinds it to a powder, and then the stone grows to fill the whole earth. The image is explained in chapter 2, verses 38 to 45. We're told in 45 that the image and the action tell us something will happen after Daniel's time. And then in verse 38, that Nebuchadnezzar's universal rule is represented by the golden head. In verse 30, just inferior in some way, suggesting that the head represents not just Nebuchadnezzar personally, but that empire, if you like. The successor empire represented by the silver. A third kingdom to rule over all the earth, we're told in verse 39, is represented by the bronze. A fourth kingdom, strong as iron, so that's clearly the iron legs, is going to be following that. And then in verses 41 through 43, you get a little remark about the feet. Doesn't suggest it's a fifth kingdom, so it's apparently a continuation of the fourth, which would fit with the iron legs going into iron and clay feet. But part strong, the iron, and part broken, the clay, presumably, which is I presume here to be baked clay at this point, not wet clay. And then the stone falling and it smashing the rest and growing is explained in verse 44. God will set up a permanent kingdom. Rather parallel to that, we have Daniel's 4 wild animals in Daniel chapter 7. Here, this is actually a dream that Daniel had. The other one, which I didn't mention, was actually a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. Here, a group of animals are pictured in chapter 7, verses 3 through 14, and then a few more details are scattered through the explanation in verses 19, 20, 21, 23. We're told, first of all, that there will be diverse beasts that will arise from the sea in verse 3. That the first of these is a lion with eagle's wings, but then the eagle's wings are plucked, and the animal's lifted up, presumably on its hind feet, and is given a human heart, verse 4. Then the second beast is a bear. It's raised up on one side, and since we're not there to see it, don't know exactly what that looks like, perhaps tilted like that or something. And it's gnawing on 3 ribs, which are in its mouth. Then in verse 6, we're told that the third beast is a leopard, but it's a strange one. It's got 4 wings and it's got 4 heads. And then in verses 7 and 8, and then with further in the explanation, we're told of a fourth dreadful, terrible beast with iron teeth and bronze claws and 10 horns. And then an 11th horn comes up, and it wars against the saints. In verses 9 through 14, we're told that the Ancient of Days comes, apparently a picture of God, and that thrones are set up, and that the fourth beast is destroyed, and his dominion is given to one like a son of man who comes and presents himself before the Ancient of Days, and he's given an eternal universal kingdom. In verses 17 through 26, the animals are explained, but very quickly. In verse 17, we're told that the 4 beasts represent 4 kings who will arise from the earth. And as you go on through the discussion, it's clear that kings and kingdoms are being used interchangeably. So the 4th kingdom is pictured as diverse from the others. We're told that its horns represent kings, and that the 11th horn wears out the saints for times, and half a time, presumably 3.5 times. Some discussion of that. And then the Son of Man receiving the kingdom, etc., where is explained as the saints will take the kingdom and possess it forever. Well, those are the two visions, if you like, in chapters 2 and 7 of Daniel. The general interpretation over the centuries, though it's been modified some by theological liberalism in the last couple centuries, is that the kingdoms represented are Babylon, which operates from about 609 when the Babylonians destroy the Assyrian kingdom, down to 539 when Cyrus takes the Babylonians, and he succeeds with his kingdom, which is a combined kingdom of his own kingdom, Persia, with the Medes that he had joined with, and they rule over Israel from 539 to 331 BC, and then Greece, 331 BC to 30 BC, and then Rome, 30 BC to 476 AD. And so in the image, the gold head represents Babylon, the silver arms and breast represent Medo-Persia, the bronze abdomen represents Greece, the iron legs represents Rome. In the vision of the beasts, the lion with the wings represents Babylon, and the idea of standing on his feet and putting the human heart in him may in fact connect us with the incident of Nebuchadnezzar losing his mind and becoming like a beast for a while and then restored. The bear eating ribs and raised up on one side, some have suggested the raised up on one side represents the fact that the Persian Empire, the Persian side of it is greater than the Median Empire side of it. I would take that to be pure speculation, were it not that a later vision, which we're told represents Medo-Persia, has the animal with a big horn on one side and a smaller horn on the other side, and so the Persian side is the big horn. So I think that's probably correct then. The leopard with the 4 heads is taken to be Greece, and we'll see from this later description in Daniel 8, which we're not going to discuss, that the kingdom there, which we're explicitly told is Greece, is an animal with a single horn in its head, which is broken and replaced by 4 horns. So presumably the 4 heads and 4 wings here represent this fourfold division of the kingdom when the original unified kingdom is damaged, if you like. That presumably leaves Rome then to be the terrible 10-horned, well, actually 11-horned eventually, beast, and we're not going to chase into that further, nor at this point go into the question of liberals' claim that they make the first kingdom, the second kingdom, Media, replace Greece by Persia and Rome by Greece in order to make it come out in the Maccabean period. Off our subject, huh? What we're going to do is, in our discussion now, the Intertestament period, we're going to divide it up in terms of who is in control over Israel at the time of these. Well, Babylon is already off the scene by the time we get to Intertestament. You remember the return is pictured in Zechariah and Haggai, actually in Nehemiah, etc., but I mean the prophets Zechariah and Haggai. So we'll pick up with Medo-Persia, and then Palestine under the Persians or Medo-Persians, and then Palestine under Greece, and then Palestine under Rome, except that there's a brief independence period from Greece to Rome under the Hasmoneans or Maccabees. So we're going to put it in Palestine under the Persians, Palestine under the Greeks, Jewish independence under the Hasmoneans, and then Palestine under Rome. So that's the way we're going to go. So let's take a look at that. So our next category then will be Palestine under the Persians, 539 to 331 BC. And the, what should we say, the dominance of the Persian Empire starts with the rise of Cyrus. Cyrus, way back in 559 BC. So this is 30 years before he manages, 20 years before he manages to conquer Babylon, inherits a small kingdom named Anshan, which basically is Persia. But he then defeats the Medes in 550, and that gets the Babylonians very concerned about that. The king at that time, Nabonidus, who had been, what shall we say, giving Cyrus some money under the table to support his rebellion against the Medes and trying to weaken the Medes, suddenly realizes that Cyrus, having defeated the Medes, he's now in bigger danger than the Medes were. But then Cyrus first moves northwest and takes Asia Minor in 546, and then comes back and takes Babylon in 539. So that's a very quick sketch of the rise of Cyrus. There's a lot more detail, most of which I don't now remember, but have studied. Several important things happen then with the Persians coming into the empire. First of these is the return of the Jews under Cyrus in 539 to 530 BC. Unlike the Assyrians and the Babylonians, Cyrus tries to avoid offending other religions. And unlike the Assyrians and the Babylonians, Cyrus decides to end the deportation policy. Both of those two empires had the idea that the best way to keep a subject people down was to deport their people and scatter them among people of other languages, and that way they were less likely to be able to organize a revolt. Well, Cyrus ended that, and so allowed the various people to return to their territories if they wished to. So the Jews are allowed to return. We see a sketched for us in Ezra chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Not a whole lot of them do, but some do. And so we now begin to have, for the first time in about what's been not quite 70 years at this point, only about 50 years at this point, Jews are returning now to what we are here calling Palestine. I'm not trying to get into the Palestinian Jewish debate, but basically using that as a generic term for the land, and Israel or the Jews as a term for the people. The second important thing that happened then under the Persians is the rebuilding of the temple, or the building of the second temple in Jewish terminology. Solomon's temple, the first temple, and this temple, the second temple. Cyrus initially allowed the rebuilding to start, but then stopped it due to opposition of neighbors. See a sketch of this in Ezra 6 and in Ezra 4. But then when Cyrus died, there was an interregnum and some fighting back and forth, and eventually Darius the First here, comes to power in 521 and will reign till 46, so quite a long time of reign. And because the Jews had showed loyalty to Darius at his accession instead of rebelling as many of the other people had, the Jews were allowed to rebuild their temple. And so they began to rebuild their temple starting about 520 or so, and the temple is completed around 515 under the leadership of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, and you see references to that in both of those. And then under the governor Zerubbabel, who was a descendant of David, and the high priest Jeshua, who presumably descended from the high priestly line. So we have the return of the Jews, and they're back in their land now for the first time in a good many years. It's actually something like 70 years from the first deportation to the first returns, and 70 years from the destruction of the first temple to the building of the second temple. So that's basically, I think, why the captivity is treated as 70 years long. A third event of some significance among the Jews, actually two events, if you like, are the revival in Judah under Ezra and the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem under Nehemiah. These take place during the reign of the Persian king Artaxerxes I. The first of these events back around Artaxerxes begins to reign about 465, and Ezra around 458 is sent from Babylon back to Jerusalem, and he restores the people to observance of the law with the permission of the Persian king. And then some years later, around 445, Nehemiah, who had at that point become the king's cupbearer, so a pretty intimate officer in the royal court, if you like, was sent by the Persian king as governor to rebuild the walls. Rebuilding the walls is pretty important we tend to think of a village as a little town and a city as a big town, but in the time when before airplanes and major artillery and all that sort of thing, the difference between village and town, village and city, was not so much size; it was fortification. So a village might be quite large, but if it was unfortified, it's a village, and a city might be quite small. But if it was not just a fort, if it was a place where lots of people lived and it was fortified, it was a city. So essentially Jerusalem becomes a city again with the completion of the city walls there in 445 BC. So those are kind of the three major, which we say, or four major events of the Persian period, allowing the Jews to return, allowing them to rebuild the city, and then to rebuild the temple, and then the revival in Judah, and the rebuilding the walls. Another rather important event, and we're not sure exactly when this occurs and such, it's much vaguer, is the rise of the Aramaic language as a significant thing in Jewish history. The Aramaic language had been around for a long time. Before this, it was the old language of the area that has traditionally been called in English Syria, but that's pretty confusing with Syria and Assyria. So the Hebrew word is Aram, and that's being picked up then in some Old Testament circles as well. In any case, it's the upper Euphrates Valley. And the language had been around. You see reference to it in when Laban and Jacob part. They build this pile of stones, and Jacob gives it the Hebrew word for a pile of stones that serves as a witness, which is a technical term for in Hebrew called galid, whereas apparently in Aramaic there's not. So there's a phrase that is used to Jagar Sahadutha or something like that is used to represent this stone of witness, if you like, this cairn of witness, if you like. Well, then after Jacob and Laban's time, that would be 1800 or something like that BC, it becomes a diplomatic language of the ancient Near East as Assyria conquers the whole of the Fertile Crescent. They basically adopt Aramaic as the trade language through that area. The Babylonians continue it, the Persians continue it, etc. Somewhere along the line it's adopted by the Jews, and the best guess is it was during the Babylonian exile that some of the Jews put in an area where the people around them didn't speak Hebrew, and yet and so obviously a number of them spoke their own native languages, but there was this trade language available, and so they learned to speak Aramaic. In Nehemiah 8, verses 7 and 8, it appears that a lot of the returning Jews from the Babylonian exile at this point, so the sons, grandsons, great-grandchildren, etc., of the people who were exiled, didn't even really know Hebrew anymore. And so there's some translation being given when Nehemiah reads from the law in the situation there back in Israel. When we get near the end of the Intertestament period, you begin to get oral translations of the Old Testament into Aramaic for the benefit of people in the synagogue services who could not understand Hebrew. And that stayed oral for a while, and they were called targums, from a verb meaning to translate, basically. And they're still in use at the time of Jesus, and in fact, they become one of the major languages of the rabbinic Talmuds in 400 AD and 550 AD. So that is the Aramaic language, and that is important, and that arose sometime around this Persian period. Another feature of the Persian period, or Babylonian into the Persian period, is the rise of the synagogue. The synagogue becomes a place of worship for those unable to attend temple, and it features prayer and Bible study, but no sacrifice. So worship, but a non-sacrificial worship. Date of the origin is obscure. The common view is it's Babylonian captivity, because that's when people didn't have a temple anymore, couldn't go there. There's a couple remarks in the Old Testament that suggest there were places of worship throughout the land that don't appear to be high places, and so may suggest that already, while Israel was still in the land before the captivity, you were still, 2 or 3 days walk from Jerusalem. And if you wanted to get together or something for worship, there might be some local place to do something like that. So it may even predate the Babylonian exile. We don't know. In any case, we do know that it continued alongside the Second Temple. So the Second Temple stood from 515 BC to 70 AD, and we have this synagogues existing then. One of the rabbinic passages mentions something like there were 100 synagogues in Jerusalem. So, what's going on there? Well, obviously, local places of fellowship of some sort. We see from various remarks, including New Testament, that some of those were synagogues for people from particular regions. The synagogue of the freedmen's, or synagogue of people from, had come back from Antioch or something of that sort. Well, with the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, this returns to be the only place of Jewish worship after the destruction of the Second Temple, and that's what it's remained to this day. So the various Jewish places of worship that you see scattered around the world, even though they may be called temples, something or another in some places, they are in fact synagogues of one sort or another. Well, we've got one more topic to say a word or two about under the Persian period, and that is the Intertestament temples. The rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple takes place here, and that's called, as I say, among the Jews, the Second Temple, or the Second Jerusalem Temple, built 515, destroyed by the Romans 70 AD. That was the Orthodox temple in the sense that at least they seem to stay with biblical views of the nature of God, that sort of thing, and continued the Mosaic regulation in one way or another. However, somewhere along the line, a temple was developed up in the area we call Samaria, and often called the Mount Gerizim Temple, because it was situated on one of the two mountains in which the Israelites at the covenant renewal ceremonies every 7 years, one group was to stand on one mountain and the other on this mountain, and one shouts the blessings and the other shouts the curses, etc. The date of its building is uncertain. Suggestions 450 BC down to 330 BC, somewhere in that period. Built by the Samaritans, but picked up some help from priests who were unhappy with what was going on in Jerusalem and came north, etc. It was destroyed by the Hasmoneans or Maccabees, 128 BC, but is still a holy site in New Testament times. John 4:20, you can see the woman says, "Here on this mountain we worship," etc. And that's what, perhaps around 30 AD or something of that sort. And yet it was still then viewed as holy then. And it's still viewed as holy today. There's a small group of Samaritans that still exist. I don't know the current numbers. They were down to a few hundred in the stuff I'd seen from the 70s. So still have worship activities there, actually still have a Passover service there, and still have sacrifice there. So they had continued sacrificing off and on, at least, through the intervening period, but we're talking about one sacrifice a year versus, at least 2 a day in the Jerusalem temple. Besides these two temples, there's a temple developed in Egypt, which is usually called the Elephantine Temple, to distinguish it from a temple further north in Egypt. And this seems to have been founded perhaps around 525 BC and lasts to about 390. We think we have records of this really only from papyri that have survived from that period. Think that it was built for the benefit of Jewish soldiers who had been hired as mercenaries, or perhaps enslaved as mercenaries, by the Persians when they conquered Egypt. And so they lived here down. It's down or up, depends on whether you're thinking of a map. It's south on the map, but up the Nile River at the first cataract on the Nile, the Elephantine. They lived there. They might have been some refugees from the time of Manasseh. We don't know. There are some hints that they were probably polytheistic, that they're carrying on some of the troubles that were going on. We see already in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah comments that the Jews that had taken him down into Egypt, they were still worshiping the Queen of Heaven. And so apparently that is something of that sort that is going on here. I mentioned one other temple which actually comes from later than the Persian period, but since this is where we're going to discuss the temples, we'll stick it in here. That's the later Leontopolis temple, also in Egypt, founded about 160 BC and then destroyed by the Romans in 72 AD. It was built in the Maccabean period by a high priest named Onias III, who had been bumped out of the priesthood by Antiochus Epiphanes. We'll come back and talk about him later. And so this fellow fled to Egypt, and a temple was built down there by probably the Egyptian Jewish community. But after the Jewish War, the Romans did not want any places that would function as a center for rebellion against Rome, and so they destroyed it. Well, that is a very quick tour of Palestine under the Persians. We turn to look then at Palestine under the Greeks from about 331 BC to about 160 BC. That's the period when the Maccabees will eventually get their independence from the remains of the Greek Empire. We start with Alexander, later known as Alexander the Great, who rules from about 336 to 329 BC. He was the son of a Macedonian ruler named Philip, and his father Philip was assassinated when Alexander was only 20 years old, not assassinated by Alexander, and yet Alexander at age 20 had already had some experience as a general in Philip's army, and so within a couple years he was able to establish his control of his father's kingdom. And one of the projects his father Philip had had, was Philip identified himself as a Greek, even though he was Macedonian, the territory north of Greece, and so did Alexander. One of Philip's projects he had in mind was to revenge the Greeks against the Persians, who had invaded a century or so earlier than that, century and a half earlier than that. So once Alexander's got control of Macedon and Greece again, he invades Asia Minor in 334 BC with only 35,000 men. Well, that sounds like a lot of men, but when the Persians had invaded Greece a century and a half before, they had had over 1 million men, according to the historians. So what are you going to do with 35,000 men? Well, certainly one advantage was the Persians themselves were back in their empire 1,000 miles away, and they had lots of soldiers in Asia Minor, but they're all garrison troops scattered over 50 or 100 fortified areas, so not easy to collect them. Alexander was able to win a victory that year at the Granicus River in western Asia Minor, and that really opened Asia Minor to his taking control of the area. There were a lot of Greeks living in Asia Minor, and they weren't happy with the Persians, and there were a lot of other people living there. The Persians were not the native people there, so Alexander was able to get a lot of support once he won this crucial battle. And so then he had about a year to consolidate his control in Asia Minor and then head east. According to Herodotus, I believe it is, the story is he went to a place, a Gordian, where there was a chariot with a elaborate knot on the tang of the chariot to hook the yoke, the crossbar to it, and there was a legend that whoever could untie this knot would become ruler of the world. Well, Alexander fooled around with it for a few minutes and was clearly having no success. Alexander was not an example of patience, whipped out his sword and whacked through the rope and said, who knows whether he actually said this or not, "Thus I untie all Gordian knots," or something of that sort. Well, he does come to conquer the world, as understood at the time. So the next battle is at Issus on the other end of Asia Minor, and by this time the Persians have pulled together a big army and come to fight him, and there's a big battle at Issus, and Alexander wins in a spectacular way. And as a result, that opens Syria, Palestine, and Egypt to him. The Persian king barely escapes. His royal family actually do not escape. They are taken captive and has to go all the way back to the capital of Persia to put together another army again. So Alexander's got a couple years, and he then comes down and takes Palestine and Egypt and such. Rather interesting incident there, which liberals fiercely deny, but Josephus says it really occurred, that Alexander was not too happy with the Jews because the high priest had refused to send him troops as he was taking northern Syria, because the high priest said he had made a vow to the king of Persia that he would not fight against the king of Persia. So Alexander, not terribly happy, was headed that way, and the high priest put on his dress robes, we'll say, and had everybody pray, and a procession of people went out to meet Alexander. And when Alexander met them, Alexander said he had seen this man in a dream when he was back in Greece, and told that he should treat him well, etc. And then, according to Josephus, Alexander was shown the prophecies in Daniel about him. And that, of course, is not popular in liberal circles, since they think that Daniel wasn't written for another 150 years. But in any case, that's the story. And what isn't any speculation about is that Alexander, for some reason, treated the Jews very, very well, and didn't treat the people around them all that well. So, there we are. Anyway, Alexander then finally wins after he's taken Greece, and there's a story about taken Egypt. There's a story about Egypt as well, that Alexander goes out to Emon in the desert in Egypt, west of the Nile. There's an oracle there, and that he receives a favorable oracle again that he will control the world. So how many of these stories are true? We don't have time machines, okay? So anyway, in 331, he has now moved towards Persia's center, if you like, and there's a big battle at Gaugamela, and here Alexander's army destroys the Persian army, destroys the Persian Empire, and the Persian king heads for cover east toward the eastern end of his empire, and Alexander and his troops follow them, and eventually, just before they catch up with him, the people following the Persian king assassinate him and surrender to Alexander. Alexander has, delusions of empire. That's probably not a bad approximation, and decides to conquer as much land as he can. But his troops finally, when they get into what we now call India, said enough. And so they head back to Babylon, and Alexander dies in Babylon at age 33, having conquered all this territory. Well, Alexander's agenda had been to conquer as much of the world as he could, but also to mix the Eastern and Western cultures, and to spread Greek ideas and attitudes and such all over his conquered territory, including the Greek language. That's Alexander. Well, Alexander is dead now in 323 at age 33, and that brings us to a struggle for succession. Alexander's son is still a baby, Alexander's death. Alexander's brother is mentally incompetent. So, the generals under Alexander band together to try to keep the throne for the son, but they fall to fighting each other. And while all of this is going on, the brother dies, the baby dies, and once the baby is dead, then there's nothing to stop a winner-takes-all thing if it can possibly be worked out. Well, it never works out that way. There's not a sufficiently dominant winner to take everything. So eventually the empire is broken into several pieces. These are usually counted as four. Lysimachus taking the area of Thrace north of Macedon, Cassander taking Macedon, Seleucus taking a big piece, Asia Minor and Mesopotamia. So, whole big swath of there. And Ptolemy taking Syria and Egypt. Well, for Jewish background, it's only these latter two, Seleucus in the north and Ptolemy in the south, that will be important. It's only those two that come to dominate Israel at one time or another. Well, that brings us to the Ptolemaic dynasty, which continues to 30 BC, when Cleopatra commits suicide, but has control of Palestine only from 301 BC to 198 BC. While the various generals are fighting for control, there's one point when a fifth general, whom we've not mentioned here, named Antigonus, looks like he might get the whole thing, but the other generals gang up on him. If you've ever played the war game Risk, you realize that sometimes it's necessary to do things like that to keep one person from winning the game. And that's basically what the generals do. And while the generals are out fighting Antigonus, Ptolemy sneaks in and grabs off Palestine. Ptolemy is noted for reasonably favorable treatment of the Jews, both in Palestine and also the Jews who have wound up in Egypt, because a large number of Jews had settled in Alexandria by this time. So there are still some problems here and there, but that's basically the situation. And that's from a little over a century, 301 to 198. The Seleucid dynasty does not continue as long. It falls to Rome in 63 BC, but it does control Palestine from 198 BC to about 160. The rulers of the Ptolemies are pretty invariably called Ptolemy, and the historians today call them Ptolemy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but in antiquity they all had a second nickname. So Ptolemy Soter, Ptolemy the Savior, if you like, not understood quite in Christian terms. Ptolemy Fatso was another name, that probably not to his face, but various of those. The Seleucid rulers tended to have two or three names that you see rotate back and forth. One of them is Seleucus and one of them is Antiochus. In the long series of wars, they finally, wars between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, the Seleucids finally get Palestine from the Ptolemies. And then we jump on to, 6th, 8th, 9th ruler of the Seleucids is a fellow called Antiochus IV, known better as Antiochus Epiphanes. He viewed himself as a manifestation of the god Zeus. The Jews called him Antiochus Epimanes, crackpot or something of that sort, madman. Anyway, he favored Hellenistic Jews. Stopping back up for a moment, the Ptolemaic dynasty controlled Egypt, which consisted primarily of Egyptians, some Jews and others in Alexandria primarily, and then the Greeks overall. And you didn't have so much ethnic diversity that was a huge problem. But in the Seleucid dynasty, which covered all these different nationalities through Asia Minor and down the Tigris-Euphrates River and almost over to India, you did. And so the Seleucids, in trying to unify their empire, tried to push Hellenism on all of the people who wanted to cooperate with the empire and become wealthy and that sort of thing. So when Antiochus IV becomes Seleucid ruler, he favors the Hellenistic faction among the Jews in Jerusalem, and they, perhaps fawning on him to a certain extent, want to establish Jerusalem as a Hellenistic city, which will be named Antioch, okay? And he permits that, right? Well, that's pretty much a disaster to the Orthodox Jews to have that happen. We will come back to the problem in there, because that will eventually lead to the Maccabean revolt. Antiochus IV will later attempt around 168 BC to abolish Judaism. And we'll discuss all that in our next section. Huh? Well, so that's a little bit of the infighting and such that leads to the spread of Alexander's empire over almost all the Middle East. Then it's breaking into pieces with his death, and then the pieces fighting it out, and particularly the northern piece, the Seleucids, over and fighting the southern piece, the Ptolemies, for the control of Israel, Palestine, whatever you want to call it. A very important feature of this time period then in regard to Israel, the Jewish background, is Hellenism. Hellenism comes from the Greek word Hellas, which is the Greeks' own name for Greece. Okay, our name Greece comes from the Latin and comes from the name of that the Romans had given to some Greeks living down on the bottom of the Italian boot. They called them Graece. Well, I'm not sure how the ending goes there. Graecus, I guess. Hellenism means Greek-like, and so it's the name for Greek culture as it develops in the East after Alexander. So an attempt to Grecianize the Syrian culture, the Jewish culture, the Egyptian culture, etc., would be Hellenism, if you like. Well, that obviously had a significant influence on Judaism, so that by New Testament times we see Ptolemy as a pretty thoroughly Hellenized Jew. Josephus is a slightly Hellenized Jew, and there were guys further over than Philo, if you like. It appears perhaps that Hellenism was somewhat influenced by Judaism, and that's argued over some. But one of the features of Hellenism was what should we say, historians of religion call syncretism. Comes from a verb in Greek meaning to mix. So syncretism is a place where 2, 3, 4 religions come in contact and their ideas get mixed with one another. Probably the commonest idea right around us in the last decade or century anyway has been the New Age movement, which is a syncretism between Christianity and, say, Buddhism or Hinduism, adopting elements from each, if you like, would be an example of that. You see it very much in the Syrian temple at Baalbek in Lebanon today, where I had a chance to visit that just before things fell apart in 1975 or 6, whenever they fell apart. I was there in 4. And that was a temple that was on the site of Baal worship, and that's where the name Baalbek came from, the Baal of the Bekaa Valley. Okay, but when the Greeks came in, the god Baal had been re-identified as Zeus, and then when the Romans came in, the god Baal Zeus had been re-identified as Jupiter, etc., and so you had all of that sort of thing going on. That probably even is explanation for some of your polytheisms that you see around the world, is that two cultures have come together, one has a chief goddess, one has a chief god, and they do some compromise or something. We don't know. We weren't back there, don't have time machines, but certainly something of that sort has happened in history. Well, that's obviously going to cause a problem for the Jews then when Hellenism is pushed in any religious way in Palestine, and there's certainly people willing to do that. There are, of course, various schools of philosophy back in Greece, and those come to have influence in the East as well. We, of course, hear of Paul in Acts speaking at the Areopagus in Athens and talks about the Epicureans and such, and the Stoics. And Josephus is, Philo is influenced by Stoic and Platonic type ideas. The early Christians, particularly the early Christian philosopher theologians, are influenced by Stoicism and such as well. I'm not going to give you a tour of those philosophies right here. But much of the impact of Hellenism in the East was the political benefits that when Alexander's successors took all these areas, they were going to basically refound a lot of the existing cities as Greek cities. And in a Greek city, the people who had the impact were the citizens. Citizens weren't just people who lived in the city, though they did need to do that in general. They were people who had the right to vote in some sense, who had the right to hold offices, etc., in the city. And there would be lots of other people in the city who were just resident aliens or slaves or something of that sort that were much the lower levels, etc. So if you're a Jewish boy and you want to get ahead and you're living in Alexandria or you're living in Antioch or something of that sort, there'll be a temptation at least to adopt whatever features of Hellenism are needed in order to be acceptable in the society. So We see that going on. Somehow, for instance, Paul's family had become Roman citizens, and they were already citizens of Tarsus. So somewhere back, several generations back up the line, his family had been important enough to get citizenship in Tarsus and then citizenship in Rome. And that may have had to do with the fact that perhaps that there were tent makers and that the Romans needed tent makers for their campaigns. I have no idea just how that might have happened. But the effect was such that Paul was born a citizen, whereas as the military officer there in Jerusalem had to buy his citizenship. Obviously not as prestigious at that point. So Hellenism is pretty important, and we're going to see that in connection with the whole Hasmonean revolt. Another important feature of the Greek period here in Israel is the translation of the Bible into Greek, what we call the Septuagint translation of the Bible into Greek. The version got started probably around 250 BC, so less than a century after Alexander had taken the area. We have a work we call the Letter of Aristeas, which comes probably from about a century after that, and it gives us a narrative of the origin of the Septuagint. We're told here that Ptolemy II, so the second ruler down in Egypt of the Greek people who came to control Egypt after the death of Alexander, wanted to build a library, wanted to build the biggest library in the world. And so he got this fellow for his librarian, and the librarian told him that they were trying to collect all kinds of works to put in the library, and the librarian said, well, we should have a copy of the Jews' law. And apparently, according to his story at least, it did not exist in Greek at that point. And so Ptolemy funded sending delegates up to Jerusalem to get 72 Jewish elders who would come down to Egypt and translate the law. So the story goes then that they did come down and they translated the law, and the result was the Septuagint translation. However, the story gets better, if you like, as time goes on. Some of the later additions to the story is that the translation covers the whole of the Old Testament, though in fact, as the letter of Aristeas goes, it calls it the Jewish law. And that's a little tricky because the term law could mean the whole Old Testament, or it might just mean the Torah, the Pentateuch, if you like. A later addition that surely would have shown up in the letter of Aristeas, if it were true, is that the translators divided into 36 pairs and worked independently, and they produced 36 identical versions of the story of the Old Testament, which probably lies behind the idea that a number of people had that the translation itself was an inspired translation. There's some skepticism regarding the details of the story, and particularly the later editions. But the general opinion of the story today is that the translation into Greek that we call the Septuagint was apparently made at Alexandria, which is where the story puts it, and that the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, appears to have been translated as a unit and was probably around 250 BC. So we've got a pretty unified style all through that and the way of handling different translation matters there, which is not the case for many of the other Greek parts of the Old Testament as we have it. The scrolls may well have come from Jerusalem, and possibly the translators too, and that has to do with some details about the text of the Old Testament, working out matters regarding a Babylonian-type version of the Old Testament and a Jerusalem version and a Samaritan version and things of that sort. And given the date 250, then presumably Ptolemy II allowed the work, and he may have given aid to it. So we're in a situation, again, without any time machines, but it looks like at least a substantial amount of the story is true. The Septuagint translation of the Bible is very, very important for a number of reasons. It appears to be the longest translation of any ancient writing known in antiquity. that rather striking. It gives the text of the Old Testament a century or so before the oldest Hebrew text that we have for most of the Old Testament. It set the pattern for Greek theological terms as used in the New Testament as well as in the Old Testament. Put the Old Testament in the universal language of the Mediterranean world at that time, at least of the East Mediterranean world at that time. And it became the Old Testament of the early church. Obviously, once the gospel spread substantially beyond Israel, the majority of people were not native Hebrew speakers. How are we doing in time, I think? Okay. We move on then from Palestine under the Greeks to Jewish independence under the Hasmoneans, 160 BC, down almost a century to 63 BC. We start out again with Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, and the abomination of desolation. Antiochus IV had actually come to the throne by usurping the throne from his underage nephew in 175 BC. He tries, even harder than the earlier Seleucids had done, to unify this diverse empire by means of Hellenism. So he favors the Hellenistic Jews in Jerusalem, and they refound Jerusalem as Antiochia, or what we'd say Antioch today. He deposes the Orthodox high priest, a fellow named Onias III, for Onias's brother Jason, who was much more favorable to Hellenism. And that surely caused some problems, but nowhere near what the problems caused when he later deposes Jason for a Menelaus, who is not in the high priestly family, he's apparently a priest, who had bribed Antiochus to get the office. And Menelaus had offered a big price, but as it turns out, ironically, wasn't able to raise the money after Jason had already been deposed and such. But that's the danger of depending upon unpaid bribes, I suppose. Well, meanwhile, Antiochus is off fighting in Egypt, trying to get control of the Ptolemy side of the empire. Antiochus, like many of the guys who control these two big pieces anyway, had a desire to take the other big piece and get nearly as much empire as Alexander would have. So he goes down into Egypt, and in 168 BC, it looks like he's going to defeat the Ptolemies when the Romans show up. And a Roman fellow who had known Antiochus from maybe not childhood, but teenage years. I think they'd both been Antiochus had been a hostage in Rome at that point. Comes to Antiochus and says, "The Roman Senate says you need to move out of Egypt and go back home." And Antiochus says, "I'll think about it." And the Roman pulls out his staff and draws a circle in the sand around Antiochus and says, "Stand there while you think about it." And so Antiochus does back down, and he's not happy then as he's coming out of Egypt, having been overawed, if you like, by the Romans. And he finds out that a rebellion is going on in Israel when he's headed into that area. Namely, it's Jason, who has rebelled against Menelaus, etc. And so Antiochus IV decides to try to destroy Judaism. He forbids circumcision. He forbids observing the kosher food laws. He tries to destroy Scripture. He rededicates the temple to Zeus. And he considered himself, you remember, a manifestation of Zeus. Sets up a statue which may have resembled himself. We don't have any pictures of the statue, and we don't know exactly what Antiochus looked like anyway. That sets off what we'll call the Maccabean Revolt. So we turn to look at the Maccabean Revolt, 167 BC to about 134. Well, the Seleucids have put down their opposition in Israel, they think, and the Seleucid government then sends out officers to go through all the towns of Judea, enforcing Antiochus' decrees and commanding pagan sacrifice. when they get to the little village of Modine, there's an aged priest, Mattathias, there, and the whole village is brought out to do the pagan sacrifice, and one of the Jews in the village starts to sacrifice, and this aged priest, Mattathias, kills the guy. Well, that would be a pretty disastrous thing to do, except that there are more villagers there than the official and his troops. And so they kill the official and the troops, and naturally that's going to get back to headquarters fairly quick. And so Mattathias and his 5 grown sons call for an armed resistance and flee to the mountains, to the caves, etc. That's the origin of the revolt. That leads us to one of Mattathias' sons, Judah, the 3rd son of Mattathias, had a military name, the Maccabee, meaning the hammer or the hammerer, so kind of like Stonewall Jackson or something of that sort, or Tippecanoe, or one of those military names that generals sometimes get. Well, Judah then leads a military campaign and manages by ambush techniques and by knowing the terrain in a way that the Seleucids don't, to destroy several Seleucid armies. The Seleucids basically are working in terms of a build-up, and they don't want to send more troops than they need, but they always underestimate how many they need. And so as they gradually build up, Judah succeeds, and as Judah begins to succeed, more and more Jews flock to his standards. So Judah's forces grow with the success, and they match the Seleucid escalation. Finally, we'll call them the Maccabees, the followers of Judah, take Jerusalem, except for the citadel, the main fortress. I don't think that's actually the Fortress Antonia that you would see in the New Testament time maps, but a predecessor to that. They take Jerusalem, pin up the remaining Seleucids and some of the Hellenistic Jews in the citadel. They cleanse the temple. Remember, it had been a site of worship of Zeus for a while here. And they rededicate the temple. And that is in December of 164 BC. And that becomes the origin of Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication. Meanwhile, Antiochus IV dies in 163. And Lysias takes over as regent for the person who's going to become king when he gets old enough. And Lysias would rather get out of this thing, so he offers peace terms that are acceptable to some of the very pious Jews, though not to the Maccabees, and so splits the opposition against himself. And so just a few years later, the Seleucid forces come back, and Judah and his forces, heavily outnumbered, Judah is killed in battle in 160 BC. Well, that's not the end of Mattathias' kids. Judah was the 3rd son, and there are still 2 sons left at this point out of the 5. The other 2 have already died. One of these is Jonathan, and he will become ruler of Israel from 160 to 142. And the other one is Simon, and he will become ruler from 142 to 134. The Seleucid Empire by this point has been weakened by division over the question of the succession after Antiochus, and so Judah and Simon in their turn are able by diplomacy to gain strength until the land of Judea becomes virtually independent. It turns out that both Jonathan in 142 BC and Simon in 134 BC are murdered by opponents, but not before Simon has gained the hereditary priesthood and the rule of Israel for his family. With Simon's death, then, his son comes to rule, and so when you've got 2 successive father-son things ruling, that can be counted as a dynasty. Probably could have counted it already from Jonathan, but the Hasmonean dynasty is typically dated then from 134 BC on to 63 BC. The first guy is Simon's son, who has the slightly more complicated name, John Hyrcanus, and he rules from 134 to 104 BC. Very successful. The Seleucid dynasty has become weak, etc., and John has become rather strong militarily. He is able to greatly expand the Judean territory. So he picks up the coastal cities which had long been lost to the Jews. Remember, when they come back from Babylonian captivity, they basically settle in the hill country around Jerusalem, etc. So he takes the coastal cities. He takes the territory of the Edomites, Idumea, to the south, and the territory of the Sumerians, Samaria, to the north. And so becomes a very significant territory at this point. During his reign, 30 years, we first hear in Josephus of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the Pharisees apparently had been in favor initially, but by making a suggestion that was not PC, if you like, by suggesting that John should resign the high priesthood because his mother gave birth to him while she was a captive, which made some suggestions on whether he was legitimate or not. He decided to go with the Sadducees instead. So the Sadducees kind of become the in party at that time, and they will be that off and on down to even New Testament times. Well, in 104 he dies, and one of his sons is Aristobulus, and he reigns for about a year. He kills several brothers to, I suppose, strengthen his take on the throne. That not uncommon, I'm afraid, among these kind of situations. And he takes the title king. So from Judah is just a general, if you like. Jonathan is a general, if you like. Simon is not only a general, but he's also the high priest, even though he belongs to priestly family, but he's not in the high priestly line, if you like. But now Aristobulus takes the title king, and his successors do not resign that title, if you like. But Aristobulus doesn't last long. He dies within a year from fear. He assassinated killed all his brothers, from drink, and probably from disease of some sort. One of his brothers is still alive, had been in prison, and so when Aristobulus dies, Aristobulus' widow releases this brother Alexander from prison and marries him. So John Hyrcanus' widow and John Hyrcanus' brother Aristobulus then become the royal pair, if you like. And so Alexander Jannaeus, then, is the name of the younger brother, rules from 102 to 76 B.C. He continues expansion of the kingdom until it's nearly as big as that of David and Solomon. So we're getting a rather powerful local kingdom here that is really carved out of the Seleucid Empire, which has been falling apart all of this time. During his reign, the Pharisees revolt against him and call for the Syrians, that is the remnant of the Seleucids, to come in and help. And Alexander is about to lose when the Pharisees get second thoughts. Would it really be better to have the Syrians, the Seleucids, in control of the territory? So they defect back again. Well, Alexander wins, but has mixed feeling about the Pharisees. After all, yes, if they hadn't come back, he would probably have lost. But if they hadn't revolted in the first place, he wouldn't have ever gotten into the problem. So he crucifies a bunch of the Pharisees. Well, he dies in 76 B.C., and his wife, the one who had been Aristobulus' wife and then his wife, comes to be the ruling queen. Short period for 75 to 67. Her name is Salome Alexandra. And she succeeds. She has two sons, and they're called Hyrcanus II. John Hyrcanus then would be Hyrcanus first, and Aristobulus II. Okay, Hyrcanus is the milder and older of the two, and he's made high priest, and because Salome can't be high priest, and Aristobulus is given military command. Unfortunately, Aristobulus is the person who is very, what shall we say, ambitious, and he wants to rule. And when Salome Alexander dies in 66, we come to the crucial event which leads to the end of Hasmonean independence. She dies. She's succeeded by Hyrcanus II, who is supported by the Pharisees, but Aristobulus II, supported by the Sadducees, takes the throne away from him. Hyrcanus flees to a neighboring nation, opens a civil war, and calls on the Romans for aid. And at this point, the Romans are growing strong in the Middle East, if you like, Near East, I guess we'd call it, and they're anxious to come in and help out. Well, before we run on to that, then we come back and look at the some of the features of this time period. And one of the important ones is the three groups that we hear about in Josephus and the New Testament, the Pharisees and Sadducees we hear about in both, and the Essenes, which we hear about only in the Josephus material. The origins of these three groups are somewhat obscure, but all three apparently rise during this period, the Maccabean period, so 168 to 63, a century or so. The Pharisees and the Essenes apparently arrived from the very pious group that joined with Judah in the Maccabean revolt, a group we call the Hasidim. The Hasid is a noun for one who is faithful to the covenant. You'll see rather regularly in the Hebrew of the Old Testament, chesed, which from the perspective of a human towards God means faithfulness to the covenant, and from the perspective of God to the humans, it also means faithfulness to the covenant, but that comes across as loving kindness, mercy, things of that sort, because the covenant is a merciful covenant, not something that the humans beat out the features of in discussion with God or something of that sort. Well, a little bit about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Let's look first of all about their theology. We think the name Essene comes from Hasid. Okay, the problem of Greek not really having a good H sound, and so lots of things get lost. So in Hebrew you've got hallelujah, and in Greek you've got alleluia, etc. So we think that there's an argument over where that comes from. So if that's right, the Essenes are the faithful ones. Okay, they're what we might call super Pharisees. Okay, they go the Pharisees one better, and in fact they decided that the temple was really ruled by people who were not sufficiently orthodox, and so they would no longer mess with the temple. In a great anachronism, we can say their view of the relationship of God's sovereignty to human responsibility is Calvinistic. Okay, understand that's not a term in existence at that time. Their sources of authority: the Old Testament, but some secret books. And we think we now know what some of the secret books are. They would be things like the Manual of Discipline, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees. Some of those kinds of works would probably fall in that category. We're not sure what their view about survival is. Some think that they believed in resurrection, which would not be terribly surprising. Some think that they believed in immortality of the soul, but not resurrection. So I put a question mark in that over on that question in my notes here. They had a great emphasis on angels, and that seems to have come from Enoch and the Jubilees, where we get the names of a bunch of other angels and some history of their activity. Not quite as elaborate as Milton's Paradise Lost, but still a good bit of information there. And they had a great deal of emphasis on eschatology. Contrast those with the Pharisees. Their name, we think, comes from parash, separate. Okay, so they were the separatists. Not really separatists compared with the Essenes, because they didn't leave society, but a great emphasis on ritual purity and on building a hedge about the law. The idea being, if you don't want people walking in your fields, you put a hedge around the thing that they can't get through. So if we don't want people transgressing the law, we build some extra laws that put it around the outside. So you have to stop work before the Sabbath, a half hour before the Sabbath, or things like that would be kind of categories that would fall in the hedge around the law kind of trend. Their view on sovereignty and responsibility is also what we'd call today Calvinistic. Their view on sources of what should we say, revelation, if you like, would be the Old Testament plus the oral tradition. Okay, so they believed that Moses had given lots of other information at the time, and that was an oral tradition. So in that sense, they resemble Catholicism a little bit. That the Bible plus the tradition of the church, if you like, or even the papal statements. Obviously, the Pharisees had no person equivalent to the Pope, if you like. The Pharisees definitely believed in resurrection. Okay? Not so sure about the Essenes. Pharisees definitely did. They definitely believed in angels, but at least we don't hear about names of lots of angels or anything of that sort. So don't seem to have had the emphasis that the Essenes did. And they believed in eschatology as well, but their emphasis was more on the Last Judgment than on details of what might happen there. Well, that brings us down to the Sadducees. There's some argument where the name came from. Probably the commonest view is a suggestion it came from Hebrew tzedek, righteous. They were the righteous ones. Most groups, when they pick names for their own group, are favorable names. Okay, so we call the Mormons the Mormons, but they call themselves the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We call another group the Quakers. They call themselves the Friends, Society of Friends. Okay, so usually the group's own name is more favorable. Some people think maybe it came from Zadok, but don't know. The Sadducees were more pragmatic than even the Pharisees, and tended to be somewhat compromising, and in that way they were able to work with whatever powers were around, so they got along better with the Roman government, etc. We think in terms of God's sovereignty and human responsibility, we'd have to call the Pharisees Arminians, okay? So big emphasis on human responsibility and human freedom, etc. What was the source of revelation? Origen, I believe it is, claims that they only held to the Pentateuch, but the evidence we've got suggests more the whole Testament. And they were suspicious of the oral tradition of the Pharisees, so at least, if anything, in a different tradition. And probably weren't into the Essene secret books either. And I think that probably fits better the evidence we've got. What about resurrection question? The New Testament tells us they didn't believe in resurrection, but doesn't tell us what they did believe in. Josephus says they believe in no survival. Okay, when you're dead, you do not exist anymore. Okay, and that really fits better Jesus' response to them on this whole resurrection question than the idea that they believe, say, in the immortality of the soul or something of that sort. They apparently did not believe in angels, and we don't know exactly what that meant because we don't have any of their writings. Okay, whether it meant they believed angels don't show up today or something, or whether they believed that there never were and there's some other explanation. So you might say, how could they not believe in angels if they believed in the Old Testament? Well, theological liberals and Protestantism can believe in lots of things or not believe in lots of things that the Bible explicitly says are or aren't, and they don't go that way. So, emphasis on eschatology. No, the Sadducees believed that since you don't exist after you die, there's no judgment. The judgment is in this life. If you're prosperous, God is favorable to you, and so they tended to be upper class, wealthy people, etc. Well, that's the theology quickly of these three groups taking theology in a rather broad sense. What about their influence in survival? As far as we can tell, there weren't a lot of Essenes, and they tended to be withdrawn from society, so obviously not quite so able to have as much influence. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were popular, but not apparently in actually a large group. So they just were a very influential group. The Sadducees were even smaller than the Pharisees, certainly, and probably smaller than the Essenes as well, but they were the richest people and such. The Essenes, being withdrawn from society, were withdrawn from politics. The Pharisees had some influence politically, but they were dominant religiously. The Josephus tells us that their way of reading things was the way that the people went, and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, took their life in their hands to oppose that too much. The Sadducees, however, were dominant politically, realizing that meant they were under the Romans, so they couldn't do anything they wanted. Influence and survival of the Essenes, they wrote or copied the Dead Sea Scrolls. So their influence picks up again when they become known here in 1948. But there's some evidence that some of their scrolls were found in the early medieval period, so that we have a Jewish group that found some of those and decided that the oral tradition of the rabbis was wrong and went the other way. Their name has slipped my mind at the moment, so maybe it will come back before I finish this section. The influence of the Pharisees and survival is pretty substantial. They survived the destruction of Jerusalem to become the dominant group among the surviving Jews, and their rabbinic literature is by the heirs of the Sadducees. So that's the material that has come to dominate Orthodox Judaism over the whole centuries. For the Sadducees, as far as we know, none of their known writings survive. We don't actually know the name of any of their writings, as far as I know, but none of the writings that survive from that period are known to be Sadducees. Some of them might be, but I say we don't know quite enough about them to say. The Essenes, Qumran was destroyed in 68, so in the middle of the Jewish War, and some Essenes survived. Some, in fact, were apparently at the last stand at Masada in 72, and some of their material shows up in the Cairo Genitza, the place for hiding documents, old documents in the synagogue. What we call a Damascus document is pretty surely theirs, and a copy of that was found in the Cairo Genitza about a century before, no, not that long, 70 years, 60 years before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Pharisaic group survived the destruction in AD 70 to dominate Judaism, and it looks like the Sadducees were more or less destroyed with the temple. So, not to say every last person was, but something in that direction. Well, our last category, Palestine under the Romans. That's actually our next to last category now that I think about it. From 63 BC to 135 AD, where we will stop this discussion, but actually going on from there all the way up till the Muslims come in the 600s, is Palestine under the Romans. The Hasmonean dynasty ends in 63 BC. You remember Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II had fallen out. Aristobulus had grabbed the throne, we might say. Hyrcanus had run for cover, had called on the Romans. Now the Romans intervene in the dispute, and they're able to put down Aristobulus, and Judea now loses much of its conquered territories. Hyrcanus is not made king, okay? He would have been king otherwise. He's made ethnarch, okay? Rulers of a people group, we might say, of Judea. Although Judea at this time does include Idumea, Perea, Galilee, etc. So a demotion from king. This time period is characterized by what we might call the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, from about 30 BC, when Augustus establishes control over the empire, for about 2 centuries, to about 170 AD. 2 centuries of peace over the Roman Empire. That's not to say there weren't some revolts and such. Beginning with Augustine, great growth and prosperity. The Roman Empire reaches its peak in the 2nd century AD. The Pax Romana is very important to the spread of Christianity. So we have this Roman peace over the whole area. Some other features related to the Roman rule that are important for the spread of Christianity. The Romans built impressive road system over that whole area. No extensive road system to match it until the development of the automobiles in the 20th century. And lack of national boundaries. I mean, there were obviously ethnic groups in here and there, but there was no need for passports or the ancient equivalents of that to go from place to place within the empire. So very important, humanly speaking, for the spread of Christianity. We should say a word about the Herod family, because they become important at this point. Haven't really heard anything about them before this, but it starts with Herod's father, whose name was Antipater. He was an Idumean, that is an Edomite, was an advisor to Hyrcanus II, and because Hyrcanus was rather mild-mannered and unambitious, Antipater appears to have been the power behind the throne. When the Romans took over, he was made procurator for Judea for aiding Julius Caesar. Procurator meant the fellow who was responsible for the emperor's affairs in a particular territory or country. Antipater, as would be characteristic of many rulers of one sort or another, made his own sons administrators under him. And those sons were Phasael, someone that probably very few of you have heard about, and Herod, who nearly everybody has heard about by this point. But Antipater is assassinated in 43 BC, and this leads to the rise of the Herod that we call Herod the Great, who is important from 37 BC to his death. I have down here 4 BC. There's some argument over that, but that's still the standard date currently. With the death of Antipater, the Romans appoint Herod and Phasael joint tetrarchs of this territory. Tetrarch is another word. You can see arch on the end of it, ruler, and four here, quarter. It was a term used for a sub-territory in something. So they were tetrarchs of Judea, I guess, Herod and Phasael, but the territories, as I say, included Galilee and Samaria and Idumea, as well as Judea. Well, just about this time, the Parthians on the east end, just outside the Roman Empire, invade the eastern end of the Roman Empire, and they briefly take Palestine, and they kill Phasael. They capture Phasael, actually, and put him in prison, and Phasael bashes his head out to avoid, torture or something of that sort. Herod manages to flee and manages to make it to Rome in 40 BC. And the Senate there appoints him king of the Jews. That doesn't cost them a whole lot. And the idea is they found somebody who's pretty ambitious, and they will allow him to borrow a lot of money from various people. Doesn't get a big stipend from the Romans. The Romans were fairly cheap in operating their society. We won't go into that here, but so he's allowed at least to borrow money. He's got this authority, if you like, from the Senate, and so he goes back and returns with an army and takes Jerusalem in 37 BC. So he now becomes the king of the Jews, 40 in name, 37 in fact. There's a problem, though. The Romans, if you remember any of Roman history from this period, and you probably don't. I never had anything in school, anyway, at that point. With the assassination of Julius Caesar, we have a triumvirate, and it's Mark Antony and the guy who's going to be called Augustus eventually, and Lepidus, I believe, is the third guy. And the eastern part of the empire is under Antony, and Antony is very much under the influence of Cleopatra, and Cleopatra would like Judea. So Herod's throne is very insecure until Antony and Cleopatra both commit suicide in 31 BC. And thereafter, he's in pretty good shape until his own death. However, he has terrible family troubles all during this period. He kills his favorite wife, Mariamne, who was a descendant of the Maccabees, and gave him his, what should we say, his connection with the Maccabees, because otherwise he's just basically an appointee of the Romans, if you like. And then, in the course of time, he kills 3 of his sons. 2 of them are sons of Mariamne, and he's afraid they're going to try and get the throne before he's ready to give it up, and don't know for sure whether he was right about that or not. And then he kills a third son who is jealous of the other two sons and got them killed and such. So it got so bad at one point that Augustus, commenting on Herod's kosher food activities, says it's safer to be one of Herod's pigs than one of his sons. And there's a little play in Greek between hus, pig, and huios, son. So that's the situation there. Well, Herod, however, does have some accomplishments. He is not called the Great because he murdered his wife and 3 sons or anything of that sort. He's called the Great because he ruled a very large territory. He refurbished the Jerusalem temple starting in 19 BC and through the rest of his life, and then going on to 66 AD. They were working off and on in that temple, and basically had just gotten it finished in time for its destruction in the after the Jewish revolt. He did a number of building projects elsewhere in Israel, at Caesarea on the coast, in Sebasti, which had been the city of Samaria earlier, etc. And so if you go back to Jerusalem today and look at the archaeology, some of the most prominent ruins, at least that are above the surface, are often Herodian ruins of one sort or another. Some of the walls around the city of Jerusalem and the tomb of Abraham and such in Bethlehem. Is that the right? That's the right. Hebron. No, Hebron. Thank you. Not Bethlehem, etc. Fall in that kind of category. The killing of Bethlehem's children, very explicit in the Gospel of Matthew. But although we don't have any explicit statement about that in the other historical records of Herod, it fits his character very much. I mean, he killed 3 of his own sons, and they would have succeeded to him, one or the other of them, but he was just unhappy that they wanted to succeed too fast. So you can see how a non-Herodian claimant to the throne he would have considered very, very dangerous. Well, when Herod finally did die, he had prepared a will, which, however, had to be validated by Augustus in Rome. So in his will, he specified that his son Archelaus would be king and would rule over the major part of his empire and under his territory, and then Antipas would rule over Galilee and Perea, and Philip would rule over some of the area north of that, Iturea Trachonitis. And those guys headed off to Rome to get validation. Jesus has a parable about a nobleman who goes off to a far country to receive a kingdom in return, and that's something that would have resonated with his hearers because something of that very sort had happened just a little bit earlier. Well, Archelaus has several people in the Herod family that oppose his becoming king, and so Augustus gives him the title of ethnarch, but will be turned into king if he does a great job. He doesn't do a great job, and so he gets deposed in about 10 years. The other 2 brothers, however, do a fairly decent job in their territories, and so Antipas rules to 39 AD, Philip rules to 34 AD, but Archelaus only to about 6 AD. Herod has 2 descendants besides these, grandson and great-grandson, I guess, who rule as well. These are descendants through Mariamne, and so therefore through one or both of the sons who Herod killed. One of them is Herod Agrippa I, and he actually gets the title King of the Jews for a short period, 41 to 44 AD, but then dies, and his death is narrated for us in both Josephus and Acts. And then his son, Herod Agrippa II, who becomes a king but not king of the Jews. He's king of another territory, and he lives to about 100 AD. So that's the end of the Herod dynasty then, finally, at that point. Well, we do have one more section here I want to say a little word about. Well, it's actually 2 more sections. I never keep track exactly. Okay, yeah, 2 more sections. One rather important one for this period, the Roman rule, is messianic expectation at the end of the Intertestament period. There was, for some reason, Josephus mentions it, Suetonius mentions it, Tacitus mentions it. There was a considerable excitement over the idea that someone coming from Israel would rule the world at about this time. So this was strong in the 1st century A.D., was influential in the Jewish revolt, and my suggestion is it had something to do with Daniel's 70-week passage, that they probably didn't have enough information to know exactly when that ran out, but it was pretty clear it would run out in what we call the 1st century A.D. I have a little discussion of that in a chapter called The Time of the Messiah in a book, Evidence of Prophecy, and I think there's also a research report up on our IBRI website about that with the same title. Regarding messianic expectation at the end of the Intertestament period, what did the people expect? What kind of Messiah did they expect? What kind of person did they expect? Well, as we look through the material we've got, we see that the views change with time. The early extra-biblical materials on the Messiah picture the Messiah as being more than human, though there's no clear view of his deity in any of the extra-biblical materials. There's some even more than hints in the Old Testament itself, and obviously the New Testament goes that way. But the other material, extra-biblical material, seems to go into an angelic direction of some sort, but not much further than that. The later rabbinic material seems to tend to minimize the Messiah in one way or another. The Old Testament data regarding Messiah posed various paradoxes regarding the office, his activity, the type of coming, the type of being, etc. And I suggest that these are solved by the New Testament and by Jesus, their candidate, if you like, and have another article on that, the New Testament model of the Messiah, which goes by, I think it's the nature of the Messiah in this book, The Evidence of Prophecy, but New Testament model of the Messiah in our chapter that's on the IBRI website, IBRI Research Report. We also find from the Intertestament period various views on the Messianic period. How would it relate to the time period we're living in now? How would it relate to the state after the resurrection and things of that sort? And it shows us that there's a certain sense in which the views of the Jews in trying to interpret what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, regarding eschatology, have some similarity to the views of Christians today trying to interpret the New Testament regarding eschatology. One could even claim that their views of the Messianic period have a vague resemblance to all-mill, pre-mill, post-mill. They're not very close, okay, but something in that direction. For instance, the various views viewed the time period we're in, and they give it the title "This Age," and then the days of the Messiah, and then the age to come. And in some views of the end of the age, you had basically a messianic period only. So you have the this age and the time of the Messiah, and so you had some kind of a millennium, we might say, on earth, but not clear what would happen after that. Other views had a eschaton only, this age, the age to come, and so that would resemble in some way an amillennial position, if you like. But the commonest view was this age, the time of the Messiah, and the age to come, which would be now, the millennium, and the eternal state, if you like, and so would fit as kind of premillennial eschatology of some particular sort. The order of events, the Jewish interpreters this time are basically taking all the Old Testament prophetic data that appears to be eschatological and trying to figure out how to sort it. And it's a little bit like putting pieces together in a puzzle, but you don't have the picture, okay? You just got the pieces. So you look at the pieces and you say, does this piece have that color on it and this piece have that? Will they match, etc.? So it's a tougher job. And Yet, as you see it put together, they pick up a lot of things that at least premillennial Christians would say they got right. They really saw stuff in the Old Testament that we might have only noticed in the New Testament or something of that sort. So, for instance, they saw that there would be certain signs preceding the end. There'd be moral decay. There'd be calamities. There'd be signs in heaven. There'd be a forerunner, okay? And then the Messianic kingdom would be established, and the Messianic kingdom would include the return of Israel from exile, where perhaps premillennialists today would say perhaps there's going to be substantial return first and then the millennium. But even in that view, you generally feel there'll be some return after that as well. There'll be punishment of the nations, okay? And the Messiah will rule. And there was various views on what the Messiah would have to do with establishing the kingdom, whether it'd be established first and then he would be brought in, or whether he'd be involved in establishing it. And you even got into models where there were two Messiahs, one who would be establishing it and one who would actually rule. We're not going to go off there, and that's probably even post-Intertestament period anyway. Then there's the days of the Messiah, what we Christians would call the millennium, and variable features in that as put together by different interpreters. What would be the place of the nations? Would they be included in this, or would they be kind of under Israel, etc.? But usually the time of the Messiah was seen as marvelous in one way or another, more miraculous than this age, if you like. Length uncertain, and you have some going with 40 years, others going over 1,000. It was typically seen as ending with the rebellion of Gog and Magog. So that's interesting. That phrase, of course, shows up in Revelation, but also shows up in Ezekiel. And so they're trying to do that. And then what about the age to come? What Christians would perhaps call the eternal state. They saw a resurrection, they saw a judgment, and they saw an eternal state of either punishment or reward. So in that way, similar to what we see here. Well, two more things to say a little bit about quickly here. The end of the Jewish state and Palestine after the fall of Jerusalem. Both Rome and Israel, and at least some of the Jews, contributed substantially to the end of the Jewish state. The Roman procurators, who controlled Palestine from AD 6 to 66, except for the period of 41 to 44 when Herod Agrippa is in control, is not basically a very good time for Israel. It began with replacement Archelaus in 6, deposed at Jewish request for misgovernment, and so the Romans bring in then their governors, called prefect or procurator. At AD 6, when this takes place, there's a revolt of the Zealots regarding the census, and that was kind of a sign of things to come. The Zealots will gradually grow stronger as the Roman-Jewish relations deteriorate over this 60-year period. Then, in about 40 A.D., the Roman Emperor Gaius, better known to us as Caligula, has delusions of grandeur and orders that his own statue be erected in the Jerusalem temple. Fortunately, he dies before the order is carried out, but the Roman procurator at the time really risked his life in delaying that, and then Caligula got assassinated by people in Rome who were interested in other things anyway. The procurators continue, except for Herod Agrippa in 41 to 44, until the outbreak of the Jewish revolt. In general, the procurators did not understand the Jews. They were frequently antagonistic to the Jews. Anti-Semitism was fairly common in the Greco-Roman world and such. And so they tended to aggravate conditions, and in that way that strengthened the Zealots who were against them. So the Zealots became more popular, if you like, as the situation grew worse. The last two of the Roman procurators, Albinus and Florus, were especially wicked men. Well, that led to the first Jewish revolt in AD 66 to 73. It actually was started by an incident between the Jews and the Gentiles in Caesarea and was spread and fanned by the procurator and by the zealots to inflame the whole country. Initially, the moderate Jews were able to take leadership, and that's how Josephus got in, but gradually they lost out to the more radical zealots. The revolt ended in the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, AD 70, and the Jewish state, and then the mopping up operation was completed with the fall of Masada in AD 73. Palestine after the fall of Jerusalem, run from 70 to 135, where we'll break off. One of the important figures here is Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai. He was in Jerusalem during the siege and realized that this was going to be a disaster. And so, with connivance of his disciples, he pretended to get sick, and I think probably of some very contagious disease, and pretended to die, and they carry him out in a coffin, and since it's a contagious disease, nobody's going to look in the coffin, and once they get out of range of the walls, he gets out of the coffin, and they flee to the Romans, etc. Yohanan got permission from the Romans to establish a rabbinic school and a Sanhedrin at the coastal city of Jamnia, Yavne, Old Testament name. And there he rebuilt Judaism without a state or temple along the lines of Pharisaism. And that will eventually lead to the codification of the oral law, the Mishnah, and then later the Talmuds. Around AD 90, the Jewish Christians are excluded from the synagogues by adding a curse on the Nazarenes to the synagogue liturgy, somewhere 90 to 100 AD. And so after that point, there's obviously tension already between the Christians and the Jews over this question of whether Jesus is the Messiah or not, but that kind of splits things. So the Christian Jews are no longer worshiping with the non-Christian Jews. One last remark here in the in this time period, and that's the Bar Kokhba, or Second Revolt, in AD 132 to 135. The Jews at this point had lost their state, but there were still lots of Jews living in Israel, though a lot of them had been carried off as slaves, particularly those who were taken in Jerusalem. But we go on, 73 to 132 is almost 60 years, and the Romans are preparing to build a pagan city on the site of Jerusalem. And it will be named Aelia Capitolina, Capitolina in honor of the chief gods of the Roman pantheon, and Aelia is the family name of Trahadrian, the Roman emperor at that time. And the Jews realize that if that happens, they aren't going to get Jerusalem back anytime in the foreseeable future. So one of the chief rabbis at that time, a Rabbi Akiba, recognized a fellow Simeon ben Kosiba as who was apparently willing to lead the revolt as Messiah and fulfillment of the Numbers 24:17. A star will arise out of Jacob. So he comes to be known as Bar Kokhba, son of a star, kind of a play on his own name, Ben Kosiva. The revolt is initially successful. The Romans actually had controlled their empire with a very small army, and so it was spread all over the place. So when there was a revolt broke out, typically it was successful for a while until the Romans organized and brought their legions in, and that's what happened here, but it was eventually put down with very considerable slaughter. After that, the Jews were forbidden to come near Jerusalem, except on the Day of Atonement, and after that, Jerusalem ceases to be a missionary religion. Well, I think that gives you kind of a tour, if you like, of the Jewish background running from the end of the Old Testament to up through, actually past the end of the New Testament, to give you a little feel for what was going on in that time period. So, that's where we will stop then for today.
This is Dr. Robert C. Newman in his Synoptic Gospels course, lecture number 2 on intertestamental backgrounds.